What if the world's most powerful development bank knew its reforms would break entire nations, yet pushed forward anyway? In 1988, an economist from inside the system walked out. Not in silence, he left behind a 95-page letter that would never air on television, never be printed in newspapers. A resignation, yes, but also a confession. We used statistics as weapons. We created suffering and called it reform. His name was Davison Budhoo, IMF veteran, and the first to say what others whispered behind closed doors. He accused the very institution he served of fabricating numbers to force economic shock therapy onto vulnerable countries, then calling the destruction a success. No one replied. No one denied. And yet his letter disappeared into archives, hidden by time, protected by silence. What it exposed was not a scandal. It was a blueprint, because he wasn't the only one who tried to sound the alarm. Years later, a Nobel Prize winner would walk out of the World Bank with the same conclusion. What were they seeing? What was being erased? And why were entire governments collapsing right after these so-called reforms? The story you're about to hear isn't a theory, it's a pattern. A pattern hidden inside sealed reports, censored memos, and the testimonies of insiders who were never meant to speak. For the first time, we connect the documents. We follow the whistleblowers. And we trace the economic blueprint that collapsed entire countries, quietly, efficiently, and without consequence. Until now. He'd spent 11 years inside the system. 11 years watching numbers turn into weapons. Davison Budhoo wasn't a radical. He was a career economist, loyal to spreadsheets, obsessed with precision. A man who believed, at first, that the IMF and World Bank were forces for good, until the math stopped making sense. In the late 1980s, Budhoo was assigned to evaluate economic conditions in countries across Latin America and the Caribbean. His job: crunch data, recommend policy, help stabilize economies through reform packages. But behind the language of stabilization, Budhoo began to see something else. A pattern of pressure, manipulation, and silent devastation. It started small, an inflation number that didn't line up, a growth projection altered to match policy goals. But then came the moment he couldn't ignore, a report where figures were deliberately revised to justify cutting wages and social programs in Grenada. He saw it again in Trinidad, then in Guyana. This wasn't error. It was engineering, and the consequences were not theoretical. Within months of implementing these IMF-approved reforms, countries saw mass layoffs, food subsidies slashed, healthcare systems gutted. The official narrative: necessary sacrifices. The lived reality: hunger riots, unemployment, and suicides. Budhoo's own hands were in the paperwork. That's what broke him. So in May of 1988, he typed a letter addressed to the IMF's then managing director, Michel Comdessus. It opened with two words that would never leave the room: enough is enough. Over 95 pages, Budhoo laid out line by line how the IMF had manipulated key economic indicators to justify structural adjustment programs that would shock economies into submission. He detailed statistical sleights of hand, where poverty data was excluded, inflation rates misrepresented, and future projections falsified to trigger cuts in public employment and deregulation of entire sectors. He claimed the institution was practicing intellectual fraud on a colossal scale. And then he delivered the blow. I resign because the fund's operations continued to represent a massive attack against the poorest peoples of the world. He printed it, signed it, sent it, and then silence. No internal inquiry, no press coverage, no public comment. The letter vanished into the institutional void, like so many of the countries it condemned to austerity. But Budhoo didn't stay quiet. He began leaking the letter to journalists, activists, and economists outside the Washington circles. A few underground publications ran excerpts. NGOs whispered about it in development conferences, but mainstream media stayed silent. He had exposed a playbook, but no one wanted to read it. The reforms continued. The layoffs deepened. The blueprint was intact. And yet, inside those same institutions, something had started to shift. A quiet unease among a handful of economists who had read Budhoo's letter, seen the same data, and were starting to question what they were part of. One of them would later win a Nobel Prize, but before he walked away, he would sit in the highest offices of the World Bank and see the same ghost numbers Budhoo warned about resurface, repackaged, sanitized, approved. If this kind of story isn't what we're supposed to hear, maybe it's the one that most needs to be seen. A like on this video helps it reach who needs to see it. How could the world's top economists read those reports, see the consequences, and still sign off? What were they protecting? And what happens when the next insider decides not to stay silent? Because one would.
He didn't leak a letter. He didn't vanish into silence. He went straight to the top and then walked out the front door. Joseph Stiglitz had read the same reports Budhoo warned about. But unlike Budhoo, he wasn't on the outside trying to be heard. He was at the center of it all. Chief economist of the World Bank. The man who sat in high-level strategy meetings, reviewed reform packages, signed off on billion-dollar plans. And what he saw behind closed doors made him ask the same question. How can smart people with the best data keep pushing policies that explode the lives of the poor? The language had evolved. Shock therapy had become liberalization, austerity, macroeconomic stability. But the formula hadn't changed. Countries were told to privatize water and electricity, slash public jobs, and open up markets to capital flight, all in the name of progress. And the result? Russia's economy collapsed faster than its democracy. Indonesia's crisis triggered social chaos. Across Africa, national budgets were rewritten to prioritize debt repayment over health care. Inside the bank, Stiglitz raised alarms. Why was the same prescription given to every country, regardless of their context? Why were dissenting economists ignored or removed? He didn't stay quiet. His speeches grew bolder, his critiques sharper. He said the IMF was pushing cookie-cutter solutions that ignored human cost, that Washington wasn't just out of touch, it was in denial. But there was something worse. The policies weren't failing by accident. They were designed to serve a very narrow definition of success. If GDP rose, no matter how unevenly, the program was working. If investors returned, even as schools closed, the reform was on track. Meanwhile, Stiglitz was collecting internal data, reports that quietly contradicted official optimism, case studies showing how the reforms increased poverty in the short term, often permanently, evidence that countries were being set up for dependency, not autonomy. He brought this data to meetings. It was ignored. He tried to reframe the strategy. He was blocked. He warned that the IMF and World Bank were acting as enforcers of capital, not partners in development. And when his objections became too public, interviews, articles, lectures, his role became untenable. Meetings began happening without him. His memos went unanswered. The silence wasn't personal, it was institutional. In 2000, he resigned. And just 2 years later, he received the Nobel Prize in Economics not for his position, but for his research into how markets fail when information is hidden or distorted. A quiet irony. He had spent years inside a system built on precisely that distortion. But he hadn't told everything, because there were limits: legal, reputational, diplomatic. And that's when a new voice emerged, someone with less to lose. Not a Nobel laureate, not a reformer, an employee, still inside. And unlike Stiglitz, they weren't interested in writing a paper. They had folders, they had emails, they had access, and they were about to hit send.
They didn't knock on doors. They didn't hold press conferences. They just opened a laptop, scrolled through a folder labeled internal only, and started copying. It began in 2007. An anonymous employee inside the World Bank sent out a series of encrypted emails. Attached were internal memos, HR reports, and digital meeting minutes. Not dramatic at first glance, until you read what they revealed. A pattern. Documents showing that dissent within the institution wasn't just discouraged, it was neutralized. Whistleblowers had been flagged, critiques redlined, promotion opportunities quietly blocked for economists who questioned the official narrative. It wasn't a conspiracy, it was policy. One internal report, never intended for the public, described significant concerns about the culture of fear, suppression of debate, and managerial retaliation. Words like intimidation, censorship, and internal silencing appeared again and again. And still, the bank released glowing press statements to the world: transparency, global impact, poverty reduction. But inside, a different reality. A World Bank staff survey from the same year showed that over half of employees didn't feel safe expressing dissenting views. Nearly a third believed that managers actively retaliated against those who challenged program decisions. One internal comment read, "You don't get promoted here for telling the truth. You get promoted for keeping it quiet." The documents leaked in 2007 were never officially acknowledged. No institution-wide reform followed, no public apology. They were quietly ignored and removed from circulation. But someone had saved them. And when independent watchdogs got hold of the files, a new term began circulating: donor capture. Behind the bank's policies, certain patterns became visible. Project approvals aligning with political timelines, development models catering to lender priorities, not local populations, loan conditions written not to stabilize, but to reshape. In one case, the internal memos showed how a country's request for infrastructure aid was redirected toward privatizing its entire energy sector in exchange for financing. Why? Because donors wanted it streamlined, and no one wanted to delay the deal. This was the firewall, not just digital, cultural. A barrier between what the world saw and what insiders knew. A controlled narrative reinforced by metrics, acronyms, and executive summaries too dense for public scrutiny. Inside that firewall, decisions were made that shaped the futures of entire nations. But outside, the public saw only infographics, press releases, and keynote speeches about sustainable development. What the leaks revealed was this: truth inside the World Bank was a liability. And yet, despite the risks, more documents started to surface. Emails, audits, field assessments quietly buried because they didn't match the forecast. A spreadsheet dated 2006 projected a 4.2% growth surge following a structural adjustment in a West African nation. But the field report from the same period showed child mortality up,
literacy rates down, malnutrition rising. The spreadsheet was published. The field report was shelved. Why? Who made that call? And how many decisions like that had been made without a trace? As more insiders came forward, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The firewall wasn't breaking, it was adapting. Because while these insider voices kept warning, the world kept funding, and the system stayed intact. But what if someone decided to leak everything? Not just a memo, not just a spreadsheet, the archive, the full blueprint. And what if that someone was already inside?
By now, the pieces were on the table. A resignation that exposed statistical manipulation, a Nobel voice who walked away in protest, a silent culture cracking from the inside. But what did it all lead to? Collapse. Not theoretical, not abstract. Real countries, real lives. Let's go back. Bolivia, 1985. The IMF prescribes a shock program. Subsidies removed overnight, prices deregulated, currency floated. In less than a month, fuel prices skyrocket by 3,000%. Bread triples. Protests erupt. The poor can't buy food. But the loan is approved anyway, because the inflation graph moves in the right direction. Ghana, 1983. Structural adjustment begins. Healthcare spending slashed. School fees introduced. The result? Primary school enrollment drops. Malaria deaths rise. But by IMF metrics, Ghana is a success story. Indonesia, 1997. Asian financial crisis. The IMF steps in with a familiar plan. Close local banks, liberalize trade, cut subsidies. Within weeks, 15 million Indonesians fall below the poverty line. Suharto is forced to resign. Riots burn through Jakarta. Each case different on the surface, yet nearly identical underneath. Same prescriptions, same pattern, same result. Countries dismantled in the name of recovery. Governments cornered into policies they didn't design. Public assets sold to foreign firms under the label of modernization. And through it all, the institutions kept calling it reform. But here's what the leaked files, the resignations, the buried reports all confirm. This wasn't accidental. The failures were part of the model. Privatization wasn't a side effect, it was a goal. Reduced public spending wasn't a constraint, it was the plan. Short-term growth wasn't questioned, even if it collapsed long-term systems. And still, the World Bank's language stayed the same. Resilience, stability, reconstruction. Behind those words, human cost disappeared. Because once a reform is declared a success on paper, it no longer matters what it destroys on the ground. One leaked audit showed that even when internal evaluators flagged programs as harmful, the project ratings were upgraded before being sent to donors. Why? To keep the funding pipeline open, to avoid political friction, to protect reputations. So we have to ask, how many countries were forced to choose between receiving aid or protecting their sovereignty? How many governments signed deals they knew would hurt their people because saying no meant financial isolation? And how many of those reforms are still happening today under new labels? Because they are. Structural adjustment became poverty reduction strategy. Debt restructuring became fiscal consolidation. The blueprint never disappeared. It just changed its name. And today,
Across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, governments are still implementing policies written in Washington boardrooms without ever seeing the documents that started it all. But now you have. You've seen the memos, heard the warnings, followed the trail. And the only question left is, what happens when everyone else does too?
They called it adjustment, reform, stabilization. But when the reports were unsealed, when the insiders spoke, when the numbers were traced back to the source, what remained was a pattern, repeated, perfected, globalized. A blueprint, and not one meant to fail, but to function. Today, those same mechanisms still operate, only the acronyms have changed, the language is softer, the design more subtle, but the effects still measurable, still silent, still devastating. This wasn't about a single memo or a rogue economist. It was a system, engineered, protected, and until now, unexposed. If this story reached you, if it made you pause, question, see something that was meant to stay hidden, then it's doing what they feared most. It's spreading. So leave a like, subscribe, help this reach the next person who still thinks the system is broken when maybe, just maybe, it was built this way. Because some blueprints aren't mistakes, they're instructions.